The station's air tasted metallic. Marcus noticed it first, before the gravity settled fully, before his vision adjusted to the lighting that pulsed in frequencies meant for eyes that weren't human. He stood in the docking corridor while the other 42 survivors moved past him, some supported by medical personnel whose species he couldn't yet name, others walking alone with the careful steps of people testing whether their bodies still remembered how. 200 years had passed outside their pods. Marcus had gone into suspension at 34, a microbiologist specializing in extremophile adaptation, recruited for a colony mission that should have ended with his boots in alien soil and his hands in alien dirt. He'd left behind an apartment he'd barely lived in, colleagues who respected his work more than they liked him, and a younger sister who'd stopped returning his messages 6 months before launch. The suspension was supposed to feel like sleep. It hadn't. He remembered fragments, cold that went deeper than temperature, awareness spreading thin across centuries like consciousness stretched to breaking. He touched the wall beside the airlock, felt the vibration of the station's rotation transmitted through metal. The texture was wrong for human engineering, too smooth in some places, too deliberately rough in others. A woman in coalition medical uniform approached. Tall, her body covered in fabric that shifted through shades of violet and blue. Not human. Obviously not human. But her movements carried something he recognized as concern. "You are Marcus Chen." The translation device at her collar rendered the words flat, stripped of whatever emotional weight they'd carried in her own language. "I am Sereveth. You will come with me." Not a question. He followed. The medical bay was larger than expected, ceiling high enough to accommodate the massive frames of the Than he'd seen in the orientation briefing. Sereveth moved through the space with efficiency, her hands, 3 fingers, 1 thumb, joints that bent in places human fingers didn't, pulling up holographic displays that hung in the air like frozen rain. She gestured for him to sit on an examination platform that adjusted its height automatically. "We will begin with baseline scans." Her color shifted to deep purple. "You understand why you are here?" Marcus understood. The briefing had been thorough, delivered while they were still in quarantine. Voices speaking through intercoms about plague and immunity, and the mathematical certainty of extinction. 3 species dying. 43 humans who couldn't die the same way. The coalition needed something from them. Blood, tissue, whatever carried resistance in their biology. They'd been polite about it. Very polite. But the doors to the docking bay had sealed behind them with the kind of finality that made politeness irrelevant. "I understand," he said. Sereveth moved closer. She placed something against his temple, a scanner, he assumed, though it felt warm rather than cold. Her hand steadied his head, fingers light against his jaw. Her skin was cooler than his, smooth in a way that suggested an entirely different evolutionary path. She held the position for longer than seemed necessary, her color shifting to pale amber. "Your temperature is elevated," she said finally. "That's normal for humans." "Yes." She stepped back, but her color remained amber. "I know this." The research became routine. Every morning at what the station designated as 06 Mazke, an arbitrary division of time that bore no relationship to planetary rotation, Marcus would make his way through corridors that curved with the station's spin, past viewports that showed the blackness of space interrupted occasionally by distant stars. Sereveth would be waiting in the laboratory, her colors muted in the early hours, shifting to more vibrant shades as her concentration deepened. She drew blood. She took tissue samples from his mouth, his skin, the inside of his elbow. She mapped his neural patterns with equipment that made his skull ache and his vision blur. She recorded his heart rate, his breathing, the electrical patterns of his brain during sleep. The protocols were extensive, developed over decades of coalition medical practice, refined for precision. Marcus watched her work. There was grace in how she moved, even when fatigue made her movement slower. The Varesh experienced time differently than humans, their lifespans measured in decades rather than centuries, their sense of urgency calibrated to shorter horizons. Sereveth had been studying the plague for most of her life. She was, by Varesh standards, aging. He could see it in how her colors took longer to shift, in the slight tremor in her hands when she worked past exhaustion. "How many researchers have you lost?" he asked one morning, watching her prepare a new set of samples. Her color darkened to burgundy. 70% of the team since the plague's emergence. More each year. She didn't look at him. We train replacements, but they forget what they have learned. Eventually, they forget they were learning. And you? I remember. Her color shifted through several shades he couldn't interpret. Still, he wanted to ask more, but her hands were already moving again, adjusting equipment, pulling up data. She worked like someone racing against a clock only she could hear. The station operated on shifts that accommodated all three coalition species, cycles of work and rest that overlapped and diverged, creating periods of intense activity and stretches of relative quiet. Marcus learned to navigate by sound. The clicking of Kolthari pairs moving in perfect synchronization, the deep subsonic rumble that preceded a Than's movement, the soft susurrus of Verish fabric shifting with emotional states. He learned other things too. The way Sereveth stood closer when explaining complex concepts, as if proximity could bridge the gap between their different ways of thinking. The way her fingers would linger when adjusting sensors, contact extending a few seconds past necessity. The way her color would flare gold when he asked questions that surprised her, when he made connections she hadn't anticipated. There were protocols about proximity. She'd explained them during his second week, her voice transmitted through the translation device in those flat, emotionless syllables, while her color cycled through obvious conflict. Physical contact between species carried different meanings, different implications. The Varesh experienced touch as information exchange, sensation layered with emotional data that human nervous systems couldn't transmit or receive. "But you feel warmth," Marcus had said. "Yes." "And pressure." "Yes." "So some things translate." Her color had gone pale, amber shot through with gold. "Some things," she'd agreed. 3 months into the research, Marcus noticed the gaps. Small things at first, Sereveth reaching for an instrument she'd already picked up, asking him to confirm calculations they'd verified together an hour before. She would color with frustration when it happened, deep red, streaked with black, and he learned to compensate quietly. He'd retrieve the dropped item before she could search for it, would prompt the next step in familiar sequences, would position himself within easy reach. Her hands on him became more frequent. Not clinical anymore, or not only clinical. She would steady herself with a palm flat against his chest, fingers spread as if measuring his heartbeat through skin and bone. She would guide his head into position for scans and let her touch linger at his temple, his jaw, the base of his skull. Once, while reviewing data, she'd placed her hand over his where it rested on the console, and they'd stood like that for several minutes while information scrolled past in languages he was only beginning to understand. The other humans were integrating into the station's rhythms. Marcus would see them in communal areas, usually surrounded by coalition personnel who watched them with expressions he was learning to read as something between hope and hunger. The humans represented continuity, the possibility that knowledge wouldn't be lost, that civilization could persist past the plague's progression. They were being absorbed into research teams, teaching positions, medical facilities. They were being needed, and most of them seemed to welcome it. Marcus wasn't sure what he felt. The work was engaging, more complex than anything he'd done on Earth, requiring him to learn new systems, new ways of thinking about biology. Sereveth was a brilliant researcher, her mind making connections that left him struggling to keep pace. But there was something else developing beneath the work, something that had nothing to do with immunity or plague. He started staying later in the laboratory. The station's evening hours were quieter, most personnel returning to quarters that housed them according to species-specific needs. Sereveth would work until exhaustion left her trembling, colors dimmed to almost nothing. She never asked him to stay. She would simply continue working, and he would continue watching, and eventually she would drift closer to where he stood, close enough that he could feel her breathing, could sense the electromagnetic fields her nervous system generated. The first time she leaned against him, Marcus went very still. Her weight was lighter than he'd expected, her body temperature dropping as fatigue set in. She'd made a small sound, not quite a sigh, something between surrender and relief, and her color had bloomed gold across her skin. "Is this allowed?" he'd asked. "The protocols are unclear." Her voice came muffled against his shoulder. "Proximity for medical purposes is permitted. This may qualify." "This isn't medical." "No." Her color deepened. "It is not. But she didn't move away, and Marcus found his arm settling around her shoulders, supporting her weight. Her hand had come to rest over his heart, palm pressed flat, and he'd felt her entire body relax into the contact. It became their pattern, work until she couldn't anymore, until the plague's fog made everything uncertain except his physical presence. Then closeness, his heartbeat steady under her palm while her colors cycled through what might have been dreams, or might have been ways of processing what they couldn't articulate in either of their languages. The coalition medical director was a Thun named Corvesh, his massive frame requiring specially reinforced furniture and careful movement through station corridors designed for smaller species. He spoke slowly, each word emerging after careful consideration, his voice so deep Marcus felt it in his chest rather than heard it with his ears. "We have isolated 3 factors in human immunity," Corvesh said, holographic models rotating in the air between them. 2 can be synthesized with existing technology. The 3rd requires refinement we do not yet possess. Marcus studied the models. The molecular structures were familiar: enzymes, receptor proteins, the intricate machinery of immune response. How long until synthesis? For the first 2 factors, perhaps 2 years. For the 3rd, Corvesh's color shifted. A subtle darkening that Marcus had learned indicated uncertainty. Unknown. The degradation affects our ability to maintain precision. Each generation of researchers begins from a diminished baseline. Serevith stood beside Marcus, her color cycling through shades of gray-green. "But the partial synthesis would help," she said. "It would slow progression, perhaps grant additional years of cognitive function for some individuals." Corvesh's attention focused on her. Those in early stages would benefit most. The implications settled into Marcus's awareness like weight. Early stages. Sereveth, who was forgetting instrument placements and calculation sequences. Sereveth, who needed his heartbeat to sleep, who colored gold when his hand steadied her. "Priority allocation will be limited," Corvesh continued. "We have protocols for determining medical necessity." Protocols. The Coalition had protocols for everything. Marcus had learned to recognize them as the framework that kept desperate people from making desperate choices, but also as the structures that made certain choices inevitable. After the meeting, Sereveth returned to the laboratory alone. Marcus found her there an hour later, standing motionless in front of a display showing the molecular structures Corvesh had presented. Her color was muted, almost gray. "You would qualify for the first treatments," Marcus said. "Yes." She didn't look at him. "Working closely with human subjects, measurable cognitive decline, continued research value." The translation device flattened her words, but he heard bitterness underneath. "All the correct criteria." Marcus moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the electromagnetic field she generated, the pulse of her nervous system making his own nerves respond with awareness. "You don't want it?" "I want." She stopped. Started again. "The treatment would restore what I have lost, allow me to work independently. I would not need—" Another pause. Her color shifted to amber. The dependency would end. He understood what she wasn't saying. The late nights, the weight of her leaning into him, the ritual of his heartbeat under her palm, all of it predicated on her deterioration, on needs created by the plague's progression. Treatment meant restoration, independence. The clean ending of something that had only existed because she was losing herself. "Would that be better?" Marcus asked. Sereveth finally turned to look at him. Her eyes processed light in spectrums he couldn't see, and he wondered what she read in his face, what information human expressions transmitted that the translation devices couldn't capture. "I do not know," she said. That night, she worked until collapse. Marcus caught her before she could fall, his arms around her while her colors dimmed to almost nothing. Her hand found his chest automatically, palm flat over his heart, and she made that small sound again, surrender and relief braided together. He carried her to the rest area adjoining the laboratory, a space with furniture that adjusted for different species' needs. The platform configured itself for Varesh proportions, but she didn't let go of him, her fingers clutching at his shirt while her breathing slowed towards sleep. Marcus lay down beside her. Not protocol. Definitely not protocol. But her color bloomed gold as she settled against him, head tucked beneath his jaw, one leg hooking over his, while her hand remained over his heart. Her body temperature dropped as she relaxed, and he felt the rhythm of her breathing adjust to match his. This was need meeting need in the space between dying and living. This was two people who barely understood each other, finding something that translated across the gap between their species. This was probably going to end badly, but Marcus discovered he didn't care. He stayed awake long after Sereveth slept, feeling her colors shift against his skin, her electromagnetic field pulsing in time with dreams he couldn't access. Outside the laboratory, the station rotated through its endless cycle. Inside, in the dark, they breathed together. The treatment trials were scheduled for 6 weeks out. Sereveth received official notification, priority placement due to her research value, and documented cognitive decline. She would be among the first dozen coalition personnel to receive the partial synthesis, the approximation of human immunity that might buy her years of clear thinking. She told Marcus about it in the laboratory, her voice flat through the translation device. Her color cycling through shades he'd learned meant conflict. They were alone, most of the station operating on night cycle, the corridors outside quiet except for the occasional Kolthari pair, moving with their synchronized clicking. "Congratulations," Marcus said, because he was supposed to. "Yes." Sereveth's hands moved across the console, pulling up data neither of them were actually reviewing. A fortunate outcome. They'd been working together for 4 months. Marcus knew the angle of her shoulders when she was uncertain, knew the specific shade of amber that meant she was processing something she couldn't verbalize. He knew the weight of her against him, the rhythm of her breathing when she slept, the way her hand would search for his heartbeat even before she was fully conscious. "You don't seem convinced," he said. "The treatment represents optimal medical strategy." Her color darkened. "The protocols are clear." "That's not what I asked." Sereveth turned to face him. In the laboratory's low lighting, her skin seemed to glow from within, colors shifting too quickly for him to track. "What I feel is not relevant to medical necessity. It's relevant to you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I have become accustomed to certain patterns." Marcus moved closer. Not touching, not yet, but near enough to feel the electromagnetic pulse of her nervous system. "So have I. The patterns exist because I'm failing." Her color went dark red. "Because pieces of my memory are deteriorating. Because I cannot maintain basic function without external support. And if you could function independently, you wouldn't need the patterns anymore." "Correct. And that's what you want?" "Independence." Sereveth's color cycled through several shades too quickly to interpret. "What I want is not the correct question. The treatment will restore cognitive capacity. I will be able to work without assistance. I will remember procedures without prompting. I will not need—" She stopped. "The dependency will end." Marcus understood the space between what she was saying and what she meant. The treatment would save her mind, but end the intimacy that had developed from her deterioration. She would be restored, independent, functional. She would not need his heartbeat to sleep, his warmth to steady herself, his presence to mark the difference between one day and the next. "Maybe dependency isn't the right word," he said quietly. Her eyes focused on him, processing light in spectrums he couldn't access. "What word would you use?" Marcus thought about the last 4 months. The gradual accumulation of contact, the way proximity had deepened into something neither of them had named, the late nights when she would work until collapse and he would catch her, every time, his body already positioned to support her weight before she fell. The mornings when he would wake to find her hand over his heart, her colors cycling through dreams while her electromagnetic field pulsed against his skin. "Connection," he said. Sereveth's color bloomed gold, then faded to pale amber, then cycled through uncertainty again. "Connection implies mutuality. My need is medical. Yours is also not medical." She went very still. Outside, somewhere in the station's rotation, a shift change was occurring. The subtle adjustment of gravity, the distant hum of systems recalibrating. Inside the laboratory, Marcus waited while Sereveth processed what he'd admitted. "The protocols," she said finally, "do not account for this variable." "No," Marcus agreed, "they don't." That night, she worked until exhaustion. Marcus had started recognizing the signs, the way her movements would slow, colors dimming toward gray, her hands trembling when she reached for instruments. He would position himself nearby, close enough to catch her when the moment came. But this time, when Sereveth's strength failed, she turned toward him deliberately. Not falling, not collapsing, choosing. Her arms came around him while her color bloomed gold across every visible surface of her skin, and Marcus felt the full weight of her pressed against him with intention rather than necessity. They stood like that, her head tucked beneath his jaw, his arms around her shoulders. Her hand found his heart, palm flat over the steady rhythm she'd been using as an anchor for months. But this time, when her breathing slowed toward sleep, she whispered something in her own language, syllables the translation device didn't render, sounds that carried meaning in frequencies he couldn't quite hear, but felt in his chest anyway. Marcus carried her to the rest area, laid her down on the platform that configured itself for her body, started to step back. Her hand caught his wrist. Stay. Not protocol. Definitely, explicitly not protocol. But Marcus lay down beside her anyway, and Sereveth curled into him with her entire body, leg hooked over his, arm across his chest, face pressed against his neck, where his pulse beat closest to the surface. 6 weeks, she said into his skin. I know. Then the treatment. Then restoration. Yes. Then independence. Her voice was barely audible, even through the translator. Marcus's arm tightened around her. If that's what you want. Sereveth's color cycled through every shade he'd learned to associate with her. Uncertainty, conflict, need, want, the gold that seemed to be reserved only for moments like this. Her hand pressed harder against his heart, as if trying to memorize the rhythm. I do not know what I want, she whispered. I only know what I need to survive. He didn't have an answer to that. So he just held her while she slept, feeling her colors shift against his skin, her electromagnetic field pulsing in patterns that might have been dreams or might have been the way her mind processed impossible choices. The other humans were building lives. Marcus would see them in the communal areas, eating food synthesized to approximate Earth nutrition, speaking languages that blended coalition syntax with human idioms. Some had paired with Kolthari research teams, their work requiring constant proximity to the synchronized pairs who thought in parallel streams. Others served as living databases for Tharn scholars, their memories stable where coalition memory was failing. A few had formed what looked like genuine friendships, relationships that transcended the desperate utility of plague and immunity. Marcus watched them integrate and felt himself remaining separate, not hostile, not resistant, just contained in a space that included only the laboratory, Sereveth, and the hours between collapse and morning when they would lie together in the dark, while her colors cycled through dreams. Chen Mei found him in one of the observation lounges, staring out at the stars through a viewport that curved with the station's rotation. She'd been in his cohort on the colony ship, a botanist specializing in terraforming ecosystems. They'd never been close, but proximity in a small group created its own form of intimacy. You look like someone waiting for bad news, she said in Mandarin, settling into the seat beside him. Marcus responded in the same language, grateful for the privacy it created. Just thinking. About your Varesh? She's not mine. She might disagree with that assessment. May gestured vaguely toward the corridor. Everyone's noticed. The way you two orbit each other. The way she lights up when you're around. Marcus didn't deny it. It's temporary. She's receiving treatment in a few weeks. Won't need the proximity anymore. And you think that ends it? That's what she thinks. May was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what's strange about this place? How much we're needed. Back on Earth, I was one researcher among thousands. Here, I'm irreplaceable. They look at me like I'm carrying the future in my cells. She paused. It should feel good. Being essential, but it just feels like pressure. Marcus understood. The weight of being necessary, of having survival, depend on your continued presence. Do you want to leave? They won't let us. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She didn't sound angry about it, just stating facts. But even if they would, I'm not sure where we'd go. Earth is 200 years gone. The colony we were supposed to build doesn't exist. This is what we have. Does that bother you? Ask me in 6 months. May stood, touched his shoulder briefly. Don't let her convince herself she doesn't want what she obviously does. Sometimes the protocols are wrong. After she left, Marcus stayed at the viewport. The stars didn't change. didn't move in any way his eyes could detect, but the station rotated and the view shifted incrementally, and eventually he made his way back to the laboratory where Serevith was waiting. She was working when he arrived, her colors vibrant with concentration, but the moment he entered she shifted to pale amber, and her posture changed, shoulders relaxing, movements slowing. He'd become her signal that she could stop performing functionality, could allow the exhaustion to show. "How much longer until you need rest?" he asked. "Perhaps an hour." She didn't look at him, but her color deepened. "Perhaps less." Marcus settled into his usual position, close enough to catch her when the moment came. They worked in companionable silence, him reviewing data he only partially understood, her making calculations that would occasionally slip from her grasp. When she forgot a sequence, he would prompt her gently. When her hand trembled, he would steady it with his own. At some point, Serevith stopped pretending to work. She simply stood there, colors cycling through uncertainty, her body angled toward him. "The treatment trials have a 93% success rate," she said quietly. "That's good. The 7% who do not respond successfully experience accelerated cognitive decline." Marcus went still. "They didn't mention that." "It is in the detailed medical documentation. Small print, as you say." Her color darkened to burgundy. "The risk is considered acceptable given the alternative, which is continued deterioration, loss of function, eventually loss of self." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have perhaps 2 years before that occurs naturally. The treatment offers the possibility of many more years with restored capacity, or immediate acceleration toward the end. 7%. Not high odds, but not negligible either." Marcus thought about the other 93%. Restoration, independence, the clean severing of dependency. Then he thought about the 7% who would lose themselves faster, who would gamble for more time and lose everything instead. "You don't have to take it," he said. "If I do not, I continue to decline. Slowly, but inevitably. And if you do, you have a 7% chance of declining rapidly." "Yes. Those aren't great options." Serevith's color went pale amber, shot through with gold. "No, they are not." She moved closer. Close enough that Marcus could feel her electromagnetic field pulsing against his skin, could see the minute trembling in her hands. Close enough to touch, but she didn't. She just stood there, processing light in spectrums he couldn't see, reading information in his expression that he wasn't sure he wanted to reveal. "If the treatment succeeds," she said carefully, "I will not need you anymore. Not physically, not for stability or memory support or sleep regulation. I know, but if it fails, I will need you more. Until I need nothing. Until I am nothing." Marcus's throat felt tight. "Is that why you haven't decided?" "I have decided. The protocols are clear. Medical necessity outweighs personal preference." Her color cycled through several shades. "I am simply uncertain whether I can follow through." He reached for her then, slowly enough that she could step back if she wanted. She didn't. His hand settled on her shoulder, thumb against the cool skin of her throat where he could feel the pulse of her blood moving too fast. Her eyes closed, and her color bloomed gold so bright it hurt to look at directly. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "Not the protocols, not medical necessity. What do you actually want?" Serevith's hand came up to cover his where it rested against her shoulder. Her fingers were trembling. "I want more time." "With clear thinking or with me?" "Yes," she whispered. Marcus pulled her closer, felt her body mold against his, her head tucking beneath his jaw in the position that had become familiar. Her hand found his heart, palm flat over the rhythm she'd been using as an anchor for months. They stood like that while the station rotated around them, while time moved forward whether they wanted it to or not. 6 weeks, Serevith said into his chest. "We have 6 weeks." "It is not enough." "No," Marcus agreed, "it's not." But it was what they had, so they took it. That night, and every night after, Serevith worked until exhaustion, and Marcus caught her, every time. They would lie together in the dark, while her colors cycled through dreams and his heartbeat marked the hours. They didn't talk about the treatment, didn't discuss the protocols or the probabilities, or what would happen when the 6 weeks ended. They just existed in the space between dying and living, taking what comfort they could find in the warmth of skin against skin, and the steady rhythm of a heart that kept beating regardless of plague or immunity or the impossible mathematics of interspecies connection. 3 weeks before the treatment, Serevith began having gaps in her memory that lasted longer than moments. Marcus would find her staring at equipment she'd used for years, confusion coloring her burgundy and black. She would start sentences and forget how to finish them. Once she looked at him with complete blankness, no recognition in her eyes at all, and he'd felt something in his chest crack apart. The blankness lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then her color bloomed gold, and she'd said his name like a prayer, like relief, like coming home after being lost. Her hands had reached for him, and he'd pulled her close while she trembled against him. "It is getting worse," she said into his shoulder. "I know. Faster than predicted." Marcus held her tighter. "The treatment, 3 weeks is a long time." Her voice was barely audible through the translator. "I may not recognize you in 3 weeks." He didn't have a response to that, so he just held her while she shook, her electromagnetic field pulsing erratically, her colors cycling through fear and need, and something that might have been grief for what she was losing in real time. The research director, a Coultery pair named Vesh and Kren, called Marcus into their office 2 days later. They moved in perfect synchronization, one speaking while the other pulled up medical records, their coordination so seamless it was like watching a single organism with 2 bodies. "Sereveth's cognitive decline has accelerated," Vesh said. "We are considering moving her treatment date forward," Kren continued. "To mitigate risk of permanent damage," they finished together. Marcus studied the medical readouts they'd displayed. The neural degradation was visible in the scans, areas of Sereveth's brain going dark, connections severing, the architecture of thought crumbling in slow motion. "How soon?" 5 days, Vesh said. "If she consents," Kren added. They looked at him with their compound eyes, seeing him from slightly different angles simultaneously. "We understand you have become close. Closer than typical research partnerships," Vesh said. "We believe your input may influence her decision." Marcus felt the weight of what they were asking. "You want me to convince her to take the treatment?" "We want her to survive," they said together. "As do you." After the meeting, Marcus returned to the laboratory. Sereveth was there, her colors muted, her movements slow. She was reviewing data, but he could see her hands shaking, could see the way her eyes would lose focus and then snap back to clarity with visible effort. "They want to move the treatment forward," he said. "I know, they informed me an hour ago." She didn't look at him. 5 days. "Will you do it?" Sereveth's color cycled through several shades. "I do not know if I can make that decision anymore. Today I forgot the name of my research specialty. Yesterday I could not remember how to access my own files. Tomorrow I may not remember why the treatment is necessary." Marcus moved to stand beside her, close enough to touch, but he waited. "What do you remember right now?" "You." Her color shifted to pale amber. "I remember you." He reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. Her skin was cool, trembling. "Then let me help you decide. The protocols. Fuck the protocols." The harshness in his voice surprised them both. "You're losing yourself. I'm watching you disappear. If the treatment can stop that, even if there's risk, isn't it worth trying?" Sereveth turned to face him fully. Her eyes processed light he couldn't see, read information in his expression he didn't know he was revealing. "And if it fails? If I deteriorate faster? Then we'll have less time, but at least we'll have tried." "We." Her color bloomed gold. "You keep saying we, because that's what this is." Marcus pulled her closer, felt her body against his, her electromagnetic field pulsing against his skin. "You think the treatment ending your dependency ends this? You think restoration means I stop?" He caught himself. "You think I'm here because you need me, aren't you?" "No." He said it quietly, but with certainty. "I'm here because I need you too." Sereveth's colors cycled through every shade he'd learned to recognize. Surprise, uncertainty, fear, want, need. Her hand came up to his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw, his cheekbone, the hollow of his temple. Touch as information transfer, sensation coded with emotional data he couldn't receive, but could feel anyway in how carefully she was memorizing him. "If I take the treatment and it succeeds," she said slowly, "I will not need you for stability, for memory, for sleep. I know, but perhaps I will need you anyway, in different ways. Perhaps. And if it fails... Marcus kissed her. Not protocol, definitely not protocol. But he'd stopped caring about protocols somewhere around the third week, when she'd looked at him with blankness and then recognition, and he'd understood he was in deeper than immunity or research, or the careful distance he usually maintained between himself and other people. Sereveth made a sound against his mouth. Surprise, maybe, or relief. Her colors bloomed so bright he could see them through his closed eyelids. Her hands came up to his face, holding him there while she kissed him back with a desperation that suggested she knew they were running out of time. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Sereveth's color was pale amber shot through with gold. That was not scientifically necessary. No, Marcus agreed. It wasn't. I will take the treatment. Her voice was quiet, but certain. In 5 days. And then we will see what remains when dependency is not the foundation. Marcus pulled her close, felt her settle against him in the position that had become their ritual. Her hand found his heart, palm flat over the steady rhythm. Whatever remains, he said into her hair, we'll figure it out. She didn't respond, just held him tighter, her electromagnetic field pulsing against his skin, her colors cycling through something that might have been hope or might have been farewell. The 5 days contracted to moments. Marcus tried to hold on to them. The hours in the laboratory, the nights when Sereveth would work until collapse and he would catch her, the mornings when he would wake to find her hand over his heart. But time had its own momentum, indifferent to wanting or needing or the way two people from different species had found something that translated across the gap between their biologies. Sereveth's decline accelerated. By the second day, she was forgetting Marcus's name for stretches that lasted minutes. By the fourth, she would look at him with confusion, her colors cycling through uncertainty before recognition would return, and she would color gold with relief. Each gap felt like a small death, a preview of what would happen if the treatment failed or if they did nothing at all. The night before the procedure, Sereveth couldn't work. Her hands shook too badly to hold instruments. Her mind couldn't track data long enough to process it. Marcus found her standing in the center of the laboratory, colors muted to almost gray, her entire body trembling. I am afraid, she said when he approached. Marcus had never heard her admit fear before. Of the treatment? Of forgetting you permanently? Of waking up and not knowing why you matter? Her color shifted to burgundy. Of being restored and discovering I only felt connection because I was failing. He pulled her close, felt her weight against him, her hand finding his heart automatically. That's not why. How do you know? Because I'm not failing, and I feel it too. Sereveth's colors bloomed gold. She tilted her head back to look at him, eyes processing light in spectrums he couldn't access. What do you feel? Marcus thought about the last 4 months. The gradual accumulation of proximity, the way necessity had transformed into choice. The nights when he would lie awake just to watch her colors shift through dreams. He thought about how his entire life before the plague had been characterized by distance. From his family, his colleagues, even the sister who'd stopped answering his messages because he'd been too busy with work to maintain connection. Everything, he said finally. I feel everything. She kissed him then, her body pressed against his, her electromagnetic field pulsing so strongly he could feel it in his bones. They moved to the rest area without discussing it, the platform configuring itself for combined weight. Sereveth's hands were on his face, his throat, his chest, mapping him through touch like she was memorizing every surface. Marcus let her. His own hands traced the curve of her spine, the place where her shoulder blades created subtle wings beneath her skin, the coolness of her throat where her pulse beat too fast. This wasn't clinical. This wasn't about research or immunity or the desperate utility of plague. This was two people trying to hold on to each other before time and treatment and probability tore them apart. They didn't sleep, just lay tangled together while Sereveth's colors cycled through every shade Marcus had learned to recognize, and some he'd never seen before. Her hand stayed over his heart, palm flat, and he wondered if she was memorizing the rhythm or if she was afraid that letting go would mean losing him before the treatment even began. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, as the station's morning cycle began, I want you to know that this was real. Marcus tightened his arms around her. It's still real. Treatment doesn't change that. The 7%, aren't you? You're going to be part of the 93% who succeed. You're going to be restored and independent and everything you're supposed to be. And then? And then we figure out what we are when you don't need me to function. Sereveth's color went pale amber shot through with gold. I hope we are still this. We will be, Marcus said, with more certainty than he felt. The treatment took 6 hours. Marcus wasn't allowed in the medical bay. Protocols about sterility, about not contaminating the procedure with external variables. He waited in an observation lounge, watching the stars rotate past the viewport, thinking about 7% and 93%, and how neither number was absolute enough to guarantee anything. Chen Mei found him there again. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and offered silent company. Other humans came and went. People Marcus had trained with, traveled with, survived with. They'd all heard about Sereveth, about the treatment, about what it meant when a Verish researcher decided to risk everything on partial immunity and the human who'd become essential to her continued existence. She'll be fine, May said finally. She's strong. Marcus didn't answer. Strong didn't matter when the outcome depended on whether synthesized proteins would successfully integrate with alien biology, whether resistance could be transferred across species, whether the 7% was a statistic or a prophecy. When Vesh and Kren finally came to find him, their colors were neutral, professional, unreadable. The procedure is complete. Sereveth is stable. And, Marcus's voice came out rougher than intended. Initial scans show positive integration. The synthetic factors appear to be functioning as intended. They paused. It is too early to confirm full success, but the immediate indicators are encouraging. Marcus felt something in his chest release. Not relief, not yet. Just the possibility of relief. Can I see her? She is sedated. We will move her to recovery in approximately 1 hour. You may wait with her there if you choose. He chose. The recovery area was quieter than the main medical bay, smaller spaces designed for individual monitoring. Sereveth lay on a platform configured for Veresh physiology, her colors dimmed to almost nothing, medical sensors tracking her neural patterns in real time. Marcus settled into a chair beside her, close enough to touch if he wanted, but he kept his hands to himself. She looked fragile, smaller than he remembered, though her actual size hadn't changed. Just vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before, stripped of the colors that made her expressions legible, reduced to the basic architecture of her body without the emotional overlay he'd learned to read. He waited. Hours passed. The station rotated through its cycles, day bleeding into night and back again. Medical personnel came and went, checking readings, making small adjustments. None of them told him to leave, so he stayed. When Sereveth finally woke, her colors remained dim. Her eyes opened, processed the light, focused on him with what looked like confusion. Marcus's chest tightened. Sereveth, she blinked. Colors began to shift across her skin, pale amber, then gold, then shades he couldn't name. Marcus. The relief was physical, making his hands shake. You remember. Of course I remember. Her color deepened. Did you think I would not? I didn't know. Sereveth's hand lifted, reaching for him. Marcus took it, felt her cool skin against his, her fingers lacing through his without the trembling that had characterized her touch for weeks. The fog is gone, she said quietly. My thoughts are clear. That's good. Yes. But her color cycled through uncertainty. The medical team says the treatment is successful. The synthetic factors have integrated. Neural scans show restoration of damaged pathways. She paused. I will not continue to decline. Marcus should have felt joy. Instead, he felt something closer to dread. That's what we hoped for. Yes. Sereveth's grip on his hand tightened. I no longer need you for memory support, for stability, for sleep regulation. Her colors shifted through several shades. The dependency has ended. He knew this was coming. Had known it since the moment they'd announced the treatment, since the first time Sereveth had explained what restoration would mean. But knowing didn't make it easier. So what now? He asked. Sereveth was quiet for a long moment. Her colors cycled through shades he couldn't interpret, processing something she wasn't verbalizing. Finally, I do not know. The protocols do not address this variable. Fuck the protocols. A flash of gold. You said that before. I meant it before. I mean it now. Marcus leaned closer, their faces inches apart. The dependency is gone, fine. But is that all this was? Me catching you when you couldn't stand on your own? No. Her color deepened. But I am uncertain what remains when necessity is removed. Then let's find out. He kissed her, gently this time, giving her space to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Her free hand came up to his face, holding him there while she kissed him back with the same desperation as before, but without the trembling, without the fear of imminent loss. When they separated, Sereveth's colors were cycling through gold and amber. That felt the same. Because it is the same. Marcus rested his forehead against hers. You're not different. I'm not different. We're just not racing against your deterioration anymore. But what if... No what ifs. We try. We see what happens. We figure out what we are when you don't need me to survive. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. Unless you don't want to. I want to. Her color bloomed so bright it hurt to look at. I am simply afraid of wanting something I cannot justify with medical necessity. Then justify it differently. Marcus squeezed her hand. Justify it with this being what you actually feel. Sereveth's colors cycled through every shade he'd learned to recognize. Uncertainty, fear, need, want, hope. Then they settled on gold, pure and bright and unmistakable. Then I feel connected to you, regardless of plague or immunity or the protocols that govern interspecies interaction. Good, Marcus said. So do I. They stayed like that, foreheads together, hands laced, until the medical team came to run more tests. But even as they separated, even as Sereveth's colors shifted back to professional neutrality, Marcus caught the flashes of gold that suggested this wasn't ending. It was just transforming into something they'd have to learn how to navigate, without the framework of necessity holding them together. Sereveth returned to work 3 days after the treatment. Her movements were different, more confident, more precise, no hesitation when reaching for instruments or pulling up data. The trembling was gone. The gaps in her memory were gone. She worked with the efficiency Marcus remembered from their first weeks together, before the deterioration had started showing its effects. He should have been relieved. Instead, he felt strangely displaced, watching her function independently while he stood nearby, wondering if proximity was still welcome, or if restoration had made his presence unnecessary in more ways than just medical. Sereveth seemed to sense his uncertainty. She would look up from her work, find him watching, and her color would shift to pale amber. The shade he'd learned meant she was processing something about him specifically, but she didn't say anything, and he didn't know how to ask, without sounding like he was questioning whether she still wanted him around. The pattern that had defined them, work until collapse, closeness in the dark, his heartbeat under her palm, was broken. Sereveth didn't collapse anymore. She worked normal hours, rested when appropriate, managed her own cognitive load without needing external stabilization. She was functioning exactly as she was supposed to, exactly as the treatment was designed to enable. Marcus started finding reasons to leave the laboratory early, not avoiding her exactly, just giving her space to work without the weight of his presence, without the assumption that proximity was still necessary or wanted. He would make his way through the station's corridors, past coalition personnel who nodded at him with what looked like respect, past other humans who were building their own integration into this civilization that had needed them desperately enough to make leaving impossible. He ended up in the observation lounges frequently, watching the stars rotate past while trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with himself now that his primary purpose, being Sereveth's living anchor, had been made obsolete by successful treatment. May found him there one evening a week after Sereveth's return to work. You're avoiding her. I'm giving her space. That's not what she wants. Marcus looked at her. How would you know? Because she came looking for you. Asked if I'd seen you. May settled into the seat beside him. She seemed confused about why you weren't in the laboratory. She doesn't need me there anymore. Need and want are different things. You know that, right? Marcus did know that, intellectually. But emotionally, the line between being needed and being wanted had blurred somewhere around the 3rd month, when Sereveth's dependency had transformed into something more complicated and he'd started arranging his entire life around her deterioration. "What if restoration changed how she feels?" he asked quietly. "Then you'll find out." But avoiding her won't give you that answer. May left him there, and Marcus sat with the stars, and the question neither of them could answer until the station's night cycle deepened and he finally made his way back to the laboratory. Sereveth was still working. Her colors brightened when he entered, pale amber shifting to gold, and Marcus felt something in his chest ease slightly. "You left early," she said. "You didn't need me." "No, I did not." She turned to face him fully. "But I wanted you here anyway." Marcus moved closer. "Is there a difference?" "I think there must be, or we would not have continued after the dependency ended." Her colors cycled through uncertainty. "Unless you wish to stop." "Do you?" "No." The gold intensified. "But I am uncertain how to proceed. Before there were patterns. Work until I could not. Physical contact as necessity. Your presence as stabilization. Now those patterns no longer apply. So we make new patterns." "How?" Marcus thought about it. About what they'd been building underneath the medical necessity, the moments that had nothing to do with plague or immunity. "We could start with dinner." Sereveth's color shifted through several shades. "Dinner. Eating together, talking. Not about research or treatment or the plague. Just talking. The Varesh do not eat the same way humans do. Then we'll adapt. Figure out what works." Marcus reached for her hand, felt her fingers lace through his automatically. "That's what we've been doing all along. Adapting." Her colors bloomed gold. "I would like that." They started having dinner together. It required negotiation. Varesh nutrition involved compounds toxic to humans, while human food left Sereveth's system unable to process the proteins. But the station's synthesizers could create approximations, foods that mimicked the experience without the biology. They would sit across from each other in Sereveth's quarters, eating things that weren't quite right but were close enough, talking about topics that had nothing to do with work. Marcus learned about Varesh culture, about their artistic traditions and philosophical frameworks. Sereveth learned about Earth, about human history, and the sister Marcus had left behind, and the way he'd always kept himself separate, because distance felt safer than connection. "You are not separate anymore," Sereveth observed one evening, her color pale amber. "No," Marcus agreed, "I'm not. They developed new patterns, not work until collapse, but work until the shift ended, and then time together that wasn't defined by medical necessity." Sereveth would reach for him not because she needed stabilization, but because proximity felt right, because the electromagnetic feedback between them had become familiar, because his warmth against her cool skin was comfortable rather than necessary. The physical intimacy evolved, slower now, more deliberate, without the desperate edge of borrowed time. Sereveth would lean into him while they reviewed data, her body pressed against his side. Marcus would touch her shoulder, her back, her hand, contact that communicated presence rather than support. They would kiss, not frantically, not like they were running out of time, but with the steady patience of people who discovered they had more time than they'd expected. One night, Sereveth asked if he would stay in her quarters, not fall asleep together after exhaustion made separation impossible, but choose to share space deliberately. Marcus said yes. They lay together in the dark, the platform configured for combined weight. Sereveth's hand found his heart, not seeking stability, just resting there because the position had become familiar. Her colors cycled through shades he'd learned to recognize as contentment, as peace, as the Varesh equivalent of happiness. "This is better," she said quietly. "Better than what?" "Better than need without choice. Better than connection built on deterioration." Her colors deepened. "This is what remains when dependency ends. This is what we are." Marcus pulled her closer, felt her settle against him with her entire body. "What are we?" "I do not know the word in your language. Perhaps there is not one word. Perhaps it requires many." Her color shifted to gold. "But it feels important. It feels like it will last." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, his voice rough. "It does." They stayed like that, breathing together in the dark, while the station rotated through its endless cycle and two people from different species figured out how to be together without necessity forcing their connection. The Coalition's announcement came 6 weeks after Seriveth's successful treatment. 93% success rate, just as predicted. 7 patients had experienced accelerated decline, the unlucky 7% who'd gambled and lost. But the vast majority had been restored, cognitive function preserved, the plague's progression halted. Now came the next phase, scaling production, refining the synthesis, preparing to treat the millions of Coalition citizens who needed what 43 humans carried in their biology. Marcus sat in the briefing with the other humans, listening to Corvesh explain the timeline. Years, possibly decades. The synthesis was complex, the refinement exacting. They would need continued human participation, more samples, more monitoring, more research into exactly what made human immunity transferable. "You will be asked to remain on the station," Corvesh said in his deep, slow voice. "Continued proximity to Coalition personnel is necessary for ongoing development. We understand this is a significant commitment," understood to mean they still weren't leaving. The polite imprisonment would continue, justified by medical necessity and the mathematical certainty that millions would die without human cooperation. After the briefing, Marcus found Seriveth in the laboratory. She was working, colors focused and vibrant, her movements precise. When he entered, she looked up and shifted to pale amber, the shade that meant she was processing something about him. "You heard the announcement," he said. "Yes." She set down the instrument she'd been holding. "Years more research, continued human participation. Does that change anything?" "For the research, no. The work continues as before." Her colors cycled through uncertainty. "For us, I do not know." Marcus moved closer. "Why would it change anything for us?" "Because you are here by necessity, not choice. The Coalition has prevented your departure. You remain because leaving is not permitted, not because you would choose to stay." He understood what she was asking underneath the words. "You think if I could leave, I would? I think I do not know what you would choose if choice were truly available." Her color darkened to burgundy. "The patterns we have built exist within the context of your captivity. If that context changed, it wouldn't change how I feel. You cannot know that with certainty." Marcus reached for her, pulled her close despite the tension in her body. "I know that 200 years ago, I was alone by choice. I kept everyone at distance because that felt safer than risking connection. I know that 4 months with you changed something fundamental. I know that even if the Coalition opened every door tomorrow and told me I could go anywhere, I would choose to stay here." Seriveth's colors cycled rapidly. "With me?" "With you." She was quiet for a long moment, her electromagnetic field pulsing against his skin. Then, "The other humans have expressed frustration with their continued detention. Chenmei is organizing requests for more autonomy, for permission to travel beyond the station, for acknowledgement that they are not prisoners even if they cannot leave." "I know." She asked if I would support the petition. "Will you?" Marcus thought about it. About freedom and choice and the way necessity could become indistinguishable from want if given enough time. "I support their right to ask. But I don't need to leave. Even though you could be exploring the Coalition, seeing other worlds, experiencing what exists beyond this station. Even though," he tightened his arms around her, "this is where I want to be." Seriveth's colors bloomed gold. She tilted her head back to look at him, eyes processing light in spectrums he couldn't access. "I want to believe that, but I am afraid you feel obligated. That the connection we built during my deterioration created a sense of responsibility you cannot escape. Is that what you think this is? Obligation? I think I do not know how to separate what is real from what is circumstantial." Her color darkened. "We met because of plague. We connected because I was failing. We developed intimacy because I needed you physically present. Now the plague is halted, I am restored, and you remain detained. How much of what we feel is genuine, and how much is adaptation to circumstances neither of us chose?" Marcus understood the question, had asked it himself during the weeks when Seriveth was recovering, when the patterns that had defined them were broken, and he'd had to figure out if proximity was still wanted or just habitual. "I don't know how to prove it's genuine. I can only tell you that it feels real. Feelings can be mistaken. Can they? Or are you looking for reasons to doubt this, because doubting feels safer than trusting?" Seriveth's colors cycled through several shades: surprise, uncertainty, something that might have been recognition. Perhaps. I know about keeping distance, Marcus said quietly. I know about convincing yourself that connection isn't real because admitting it's real makes you vulnerable. I did that for years on Earth. I'm not doing it anymore. Her hand came up to his face, fingers tracing the lines of his features. What if I need more than words? What if I need proof that this would exist outside the context of plague and detention? What kind of proof? I do not know. Her color shifted to pale amber shot through with gold. But the uncertainty remains. Marcus pulled her closer, rested his forehead against hers. Then we live with the uncertainty. We keep building what we have. And eventually maybe the question stops mattering. Seriveth's electromagnetic field pulsed strongly against his skin. Or the question is answered by circumstances we cannot control. Maybe. He kissed her gently. But until then, we have this. Her colors bloomed gold, and she kissed him back with intensity that suggested she wanted to believe him, even if certainty remained out of reach. 3 months after the announcement, the coalition began expanding human involvement. Not just research participation, but active roles in treatment development, teaching positions for coalition students, cultural exchange programs. The humans were being integrated more deeply, given responsibilities that extended beyond their biological immunity. Chen Mei was offered a position developing terraforming protocols for coalition worlds. Others received similar opportunities, work that utilized their expertise, that made them essential beyond their resistant biology. The detention remained, but the context shifted. They weren't just prisoners with useful blood. They were becoming part of the civilization that needed them. Marcus was offered a research directorship, a position overseeing cross-species immunity studies, coordinating between human and coalition medical teams. The offer came from Corvesh, presented with careful formality. This would require long-term commitment, Corvesh said. Decade-scale involvement in coalition medical infrastructure. I understand. It would also require deeper integration, learning coalition governance systems, participating in multi-species councils, accepting citizenship with full rights and responsibilities. Marcus thought about what that meant. Not detained human, but coalition citizen. Not temporary participant, but permanent resident. What about freedom of movement? Citizens may travel throughout coalition space, subject to standard security protocols. Corvesh's color shifted slightly. The restriction on human departure would be lifted, though practical limitations would remain. Earth is gone. The colony you sought no longer exists. Where would you go that offers more than remaining here? It was a good question. Marcus had no answer to it. He told Seriveth about the offer that evening, in her quarters where they'd started spending most nights together. She was working on her own research, plague resistance mechanisms, trying to understand exactly what had made the treatment successful so it could be refined further. When he explained the directorship, her colors cycled through several shades. You would accept? She asked. I don't know. It's a long commitment. Longer than what we have already. More permanent. More formal. Marcus settled beside her on the platform, felt her lean into him automatically. It would mean acknowledging this is my life now. The station, the coalition, all of it. Is that not already your life? By necessity, this would be by choice. Seriveth's colors shifted to burgundy. You would choose it, truly, without obligation or detention forcing the decision? Marcus thought about the last 7 months. About proximity transforming into connection. About need becoming want. About finding himself less alone than he'd been in years because he'd stopped keeping distance as protection. I think I already have chosen it. The directorship just makes it official. And if you could leave, if the coalition lifted all restrictions and allowed humans to go wherever they wished, where would I go? Earth might be habitable again in another century. The colony mission could be revived with different coordinates. I could spend decades traveling to places that don't have you in them. Marcus turned to face her fully. Is that what you want? For me to leave? No. Her color bloomed gold. But I need to know you would stay by choice, not circumstance. Then know it. He took her hand, laced their fingers together. I'm staying. I'm accepting the directorship. I'm choosing this life, this place, you, all of it. Not because I'm detained or obligated or adapting to circumstances, because it's what I actually want. Sereveth's colors cycled rapidly, processing what he was saying. Then she kissed him, deep and desperate, her entire body pressed against his. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, her colors were pure gold. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "That restoration would end what we had. That independence would make connection unnecessary. That you would realize you were here by force and resent the circumstances that created us. I know I was afraid of the same things. But you are not afraid anymore?" "No." Marcus pulled her closer. "I'm certain." Her electromagnetic field pulsed strongly, and her colors brightened until they were almost painful to look at. "Then I am certain too." They stayed like that, tangled together while certainty settled into something neither of them had expected to find. Not just connection, but commitment. Not just want, but choice. Not just adaptation to circumstances, but deliberate selection of a future that included each other, regardless of plague or immunity, or the context that had brought them together. Later that night, lying in the dark with Sereveth asleep against him, Marcus thought about the colony ship and the life he'd left behind. 7,000 people meant to establish human civilization on an alien world, reduced to 43 survivors who'd woken to find themselves essential to a different civilization entirely. He thought about his sister, 200 years gone, about his apartment, his colleagues, the distance he'd maintained because connection felt like weakness. He didn't miss any of it. What he had now, Sereveth's cool skin against his warmth, her hand over his heart, her colors shifting through dreams, felt more real than anything he'd left behind, more important, more worth protecting. He'd thought he was traveling to build something new. He'd ended up finding it anyway, just not in the way he'd expected. Not in alien soil and human colony, but in proximity and connection, and the slow accumulation of intimacy with someone whose biology was fundamentally different, but whose need for connection translated perfectly across the gap between their species. Sereveth stirred against him, colors flickering briefly before settling back into sleep patterns. Marcus held her closer and thought about accepting the directorship, about choosing to stay, about building a life that had nothing to do with the one he'd planned, and everything to do with what he'd actually found. He fell asleep like that, certain for the first time in his life that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Marcus accepted the directorship. The ceremony was small. Coalition protocols required formal acknowledgement of major appointments, but they kept the presentation brief. Corvesh handed him a crystalline token that represented his new authority, his citizenship, his permanent place in coalition infrastructure. Sereveth was there, her colors bright with what he'd learned to recognize as pride. The work itself was challenging. Coordinating between species with different biological frameworks, different conceptual systems, different timescales of urgency, required constant translation. Marcus found himself learning coalition governance, medical ethics, the intricate balance between individual autonomy and collective survival that had characterized their civilization for generations. The other humans were building similar integration. May's terraforming work was gaining recognition, her insights into Earth ecology, providing frameworks coalition biologists hadn't considered. Others were teaching, researching, serving on councils that shaped policy across multiple worlds. They were becoming essential, not just for their immunity, but for their perspectives, their expertise, their presence as a new element in coalition society. The restrictions on human movement were officially lifted 6 months after Marcus's appointment. Citizens could travel, could request transfers to other stations, could explore coalition space with standard security clearances. Some humans took advantage immediately, requesting assignments on distant worlds, traveling to see what existed beyond Kerath Station. Marcus stayed. Not because he had to, but because leaving would mean leaving Sereveth. And he'd discovered that proximity to her had become more important than curiosity about what existed elsewhere. They developed deeper patterns. Not just dinner and shared quarters, but integrated lives. Sereveth's research often overlapped with Marcus's directorial responsibilities, and they would work together on projects that required both human immunity insight and coalition medical frameworks. They would argue about methodologies, about priorities, about the balance between careful testing and urgent need. The arguments never escalated past professional disagreement, but they revealed how well they'd learned to navigate each other's thought processes. The physical intimacy deepened too. Serevith had been right about Varesh experiencing touch as information transfer. She could read emotional states in the pressure of his hands, the rhythm of his breathing, the heat that radiated from his skin. Marcus learned to communicate through contact, learned that holding her a certain way conveyed reassurance, that specific touches meant desire or comfort or simple presence. They were building a language between them that existed underneath words, underneath even the translation devices that rendered their speech into mutually comprehensible syllables. A language of proximity, of electromagnetic feedback, of cool skin against warm, of heartbeat and breath and the slow accumulation of shared experience. One evening, nearly a year after Marcus's arrival on the station, Serevith asked him a question that surprised them both. "If you could change the circumstances that brought us together," she said carefully, "would you?" Marcus thought about it, about the colony ship's failure, about 43 survivors instead of 7,000, about arriving at a station where 3 species were dying, and only human biology offered salvation. Change it how? Prevent the plague, or arrive earlier, before the deterioration had begun, or, she paused, ensure the colony ship functioned as intended, so you would have reached your destination and built the life you planned instead of this one. Would that change mean we never met? Almost certainly. Marcus pulled her closer, felt her settle against him in the position that had become automatic. Then no, I wouldn't change it, even knowing what the plague has cost. How many coalition citizens have died? How many more will die before treatment can be scaled? I can't weigh that. I'm not capable of that kind of moral calculation. He was quiet for a moment. But I know that I spent 34 years on Earth keeping everyone at distance. I know that I was good at my work and lonely in ways I didn't admit. I know that 200 years in suspension should have felt like sleep but instead felt like dissolution. His arms tightened around her. And I know that this, you, us, what we've built, is the first thing in my life that feels complete. Serevith's colors bloomed gold so bright he could see them through his closed eyelids. I would not change it either. Even the deterioration, even the fear of losing myself, because it brought us here. Yeah, Marcus agreed. It did. They stayed like that while the station rotated through its cycle, while coalition civilization continued around them, while 2 people from different species acknowledged that the circumstances they hadn't chosen had led them to exactly where they needed to be. 2 years after Marcus's arrival, the coalition announced successful scaling of the treatment. Production facilities were operational, distribution networks established, treatment protocols refined. The plague wasn't defeated. That would take decades, maybe generations, but it was no longer an extinction event. Cognitive decline could be halted, minds preserved, civilization continued. The humans who'd made it possible were celebrated. Official recognition, awards, positions of honor in coalition society. They'd gone from detained survivors to essential citizens, from biological resources to integrated members of a civilization that had needed them desperately enough to transform them from prisoners into partners. Marcus stood at the ceremony beside Serevith, her colors bright with the Varesh equivalent of joy, and felt something settle into place. This was his life now, not the one he'd planned, not the colony on an alien world with dirt under his fingernails and human civilization spreading across new soil. But this was real, and it was chosen, and it was enough. Afterward, they returned to the quarters they now officially shared, the platform configured for combined weight, the space decorated with objects from both their cultures, the environmental controls calibrated to a temperature that balanced Sereveth's preference for cool and Marcus's need for warmth. The treatment distribution will require ongoing monitoring, Sereveth said, reviewing data on her personal display. Years of follow-up to ensure stability, to refine the synthesis, to address complications as they emerge. I know. Marcus settled beside her, felt her lean into him automatically. Good thing I accepted that directorship. Her color shifted to pale amber shot through with gold. Good thing you stayed. I wasn't going anywhere. No. She turned to face him fully. You were not. They kissed, slow and deep, without urgency but with the certainty of people who'd figured out how to navigate the space between their different biologies. When they separated, Seriveth's colors were cycling through shades Marcus had learned to recognize as happiness, as contentment, as the Varesh equivalent of love, even if no direct translation existed for the concept. "What are we building?" she asked quietly. Marcus thought about the question. About 2 years of proximity becoming connection, dependency becoming choice, necessity becoming want, about a language they'd developed between them that existed underneath words, about electromagnetic feedback and heartbeat and the slow accumulation of shared experience. "Something permanent," he said finally. "Something that exists because we chose it, not because circumstances forced it." "Yes." Seriveth's hand found his heart, palm flat over the steady rhythm she'd been using as an anchor since the beginning. "I choose this. I choose us. Regardless of plague or immunity or the context that brought us together." "So do I," Marcus said. They stayed like that, breathing together in the dark, while the station rotated through its endless cycle, and two people from different species built something that had started as necessity and transformed into foundation. Not perfect, not without complication, but real and chosen and lasting. Outside, coalition civilization continued. The plague was retreating, minds were being preserved, the work would go on for decades. But inside this small space, two people who shouldn't have worked together but did, were building their own small piece of permanence. Marcus pulled Seriveth closer, felt her weight against him, her cool skin and electromagnetic field, and the colors that shifted through contentment. He thought about the colony ship, about 7,000 souls reduced to 43, about arriving at a station where 3 species were dying, and only human biology offered salvation. He thought about all the ways it could have gone differently, all the alternate paths that would have led him somewhere else, to someone else, to a life that looked more like what he'd planned, and less like what he'd found. And he was grateful, deeply, completely grateful, that circumstances had brought him here instead. To this station, this person, this connection that had started with plague and immunity and transformed into something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed. Seriveth's colors shifted to pure gold, and Marcus understood that she felt the same, that what they'd built together, through deterioration and restoration, through dependency and choice, through all the impossible mathematics of interspecies connection, was exactly what they were supposed to find. Not the life either of them had planned, but the life they'd chosen anyway, built piece by piece in the space between dying and living, between different biologies and shared warmth, between what was necessary and what was wanted. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.